There is a quiet accusation buried inside modern life, one nobody says out loud, but almost everyone has felt. If you're not posting, you must be hiding something. If your face is not on the feed, your life is not real enough to share, or worse, not good enough to share. That accusation has become so normal that most people never question it. But empaths question it constantly, feeling the strange emptiness underneath the assumption before they can even explain why. And once you start paying attention to that emptiness, something remarkable happens. You realize the silence was never the problem. The culture asking you to explain it was. Here is a contrast nobody talks about. Confidence and visibility are not the same thing, yet the world treats them like synonyms. A person who posts constantly is assumed secure. A person who does not post is assumed insecure. But flip that assumption over and look underneath it, and you find something closer to the truth. Constant posting can be a search for reassurance. Constant silence can be the absence of needing any. One person is asking the world, do you see me? Am I enough? The other person already answered that question alone, in private, without an audience. That is not coldness. That is completion. Empaths tend to notice this dynamic faster than most people because they are wired to notice emotional undercurrents before they notice surface behavior. They do not just see a photo in a comment section. They feel the transaction happening underneath it, the quiet hunger for approval disguised as confidence, the performance dressed up as spontaneity. And once you can feel that transaction, you cannot unsee it. It starts to feel less like connection and more like a marketplace, where attention is currency and identity is the product being sold. Empaths often walk away from that marketplace not because they are afraid of it, but because they understand exactly how it works, and they no longer want to participate in something that quietly reshapes who a person becomes. Here the story gets interesting, because most people assume withdrawal means something is missing, but sometimes it means something has already been found. Think about what happens to a person once they stop needing external proof of their own worth. The compulsion to document disappears, not because life became less meaningful, but because meaning stopped depending on witnesses. A sunset does not need 300 likes to have mattered. A private victory does not become smaller because no one clapped for it. Empaths often arrive at this realization the hard way, usually after years of trying to translate their inner world into something public, only to discover that translation always loses something. The moment becomes content, and content is never the same thing as the moment itself. There is a second layer worth sitting with. Empaths are unusually sensitive to how quickly attention turns into obligation. The instant you share something personal, you are no longer the only one who owns it. Other people now have opinions about it, comparisons to make about it, judgments to form about it, even envy to feel about it. Most people accept this as the price of connection. Empaths often refuse to pay it, not because they do not value connection, but because they have learned that unregulated exposure rarely deepens intimacy. It just multiplies interpretation. And interpretation, especially from strangers, is almost never generous. So they begin protecting something instead of hiding something. That distinction changes everything, because protection and secrecy look identical from the outside but come from completely different places on the inside. Secrecy is driven by fear. Protection is driven by respect. An empath who does not post their photos is rarely afraid of being seen. They are often deeply aware of what being seen costs, and they have decided the cost is not always worth paying. That is not paranoia. That is discernment, the same discernment that allows a person to know which rooms deserve their presence and which ones only deserve their absence. Here the story usually turns, because once someone stops feeding the need for approval, they start noticing how strange the system actually is. Likes do not pay bills. Comments do not build character. Views do not deepen a single relationship in real life. Yet an entire generation has been trained to treat these things as evidence of worth. Empaths, often without planning to, have quietly opted out of that evidence system. Not to prove a point, not to seem superior, but because they simply stopped believing the currency was real. Once you stop believing a currency is real, you stop chasing it. And the people still chasing it will misread your stillness as absence, when it might be the most present you have ever been. Because that is the deeper truth hiding underneath all of this. The empath who does not post is often not disappearing from life. They are finally arriving in it fully, without translation, without an audience, without the exhausting task of performing a version of themselves for people who will forget the photo within a day, but who somehow expect the moment to last forever. And once you understand that distinction, you start to see the whole picture differently. This was never about hiding. It was about choosing where your reality gets to live. And maybe that is the real question worth asking, not why some people refuse to post, but why the rest of us were convinced that living quietly required an explanation. Somewhere along the way, privacy became suspicious and visibility became proof. But proof of what exactly? Proof that a life happened. Proof that a feeling was felt. As if the inner world cannot be trusted unless it leaves a public trail behind it. Empaths reject that logic instinctively, long before they have the language to defend it. They simply know that the richest parts of being alive were never meant to be measured by an audience. There is a moment almost every empath remembers, even if they never say it out loud. A moment they shared something tender, something that felt safe to say, and watched it get used against them later. Maybe it was a photo taken out of context. Maybe it was a private detail repeated in a room they were not in. Maybe it was simply the look on someone's face, judgment disguised as curiosity. Whatever it was, something shifted after that moment. Openness stopped feeling like connection and started feeling like risk. And once a person learns that lesson, they do not forget it. They build around it. This is the part most people misunderstand about privacy. They assume it begins with fear. It rarely does. It begins with math. An empath runs an emotional calculation most people never bother to make, weighing what is gained by sharing against what is lost by exposure. For a long time, culture has insisted the answer should always favor sharing, that connection requires constant transparency, that closeness is measured by how much you reveal. But empaths eventually notice a flaw in that equation. Not every audience deserves the numerator. Not every relationship has earned the vulnerability. Once you see that clearly, you stop treating openness as a virtue you owe to everyone and start treating it as a gift you give to the right few. Contrast this with how most people are taught to think about closeness. Share more, and you will be trusted more. Post more, and you will be seen as more genuine. Explain more, and you will be understood more completely. It sounds logical on the surface, almost noble. But empaths have lived long enough inside their own sensitivity to notice the flaw hiding in plain sight. Sharing does not guarantee understanding. It only guarantees exposure. And exposure without discernment is not intimacy, it is risk wearing a friendlier name. Think about what happens the second something personal becomes public. It stops belonging only to you. It becomes raw material for other people's projections. Someone will admire it, someone will envy it, someone will quietly resent it without ever saying why. Someone will misread it entirely and build a false story that has nothing to do with your actual life. None of that requires malice. It only requires an audience, because audiences interpret, and interpretation is never neutral. Empaths tend to feel this instinctively, long before they can explain it in words. They sense the moment a private truth becomes public property. and something in them resists handing it over. This is not withdrawal from the world, this is precision about who gets access to it. And precision, once you understand it clearly, is one of the most underrated forms of emotional intelligence a person can develop. Anyone can be endlessly open. Openness without discernment does not take strength, it only takes an absence of experience. But learning exactly who deserves your inner world and who does not takes years, sometimes decades, and often more than a little pain along the way. Empaths who protect their privacy are rarely protecting it out of naivety. They are protecting it because they have already paid the price of not protecting it, and they are refusing to pay that price twice. Here is the contrast worth sitting with. There is a difference between a wall and a boundary, even though they look nearly identical from the outside. A wall exists to keep everyone out permanently, without exception. A boundary exists to filter who comes in and how far they are allowed to go. Our walls come from fear. Boundaries come from self-respect. When people misread an empath's privacy as a wall, they are almost always missing the truer picture, which is that this person has built a boundary sophisticated enough to protect what matters most to them. That is not isolation. That is architecture. And architecture is designed with intention, not panic. There is another layer most people overlook. Empaths often experience heightened social processing, meaning they absorb more from every interaction than the average person does. A passing comment lingers longer. A strange look replays for hours. A moment of judgment does not simply pass through them, it settles and takes up residence. Given that, is it surprising that someone wired this way thinks twice before broadcasting their life to strangers who might comment, judge, compare, or dismiss without a second thought? What looks like caution from the outside is often accurate self-knowledge from the inside. They know how deeply things land, so they choose more carefully what gets thrown. And this is where the real reframe begins to take shape. Privacy for an empath is rarely about isolation. It is about intention, the decision to stop treating every corner of your life as public inventory and start treating certain parts of it as sacred instead. Sacred is an old-fashioned word, almost uncomfortable in a culture built on sharing everything instantly, but it fits here better than any modern substitute. Because something sacred is not hidden out of shame. It is protected because it matters too much to be handed carelessly to people who will forget it by tomorrow. Consider how strange it would sound applied to any other part of life. No one accuses a person of insecurity for not showing strangers their bank statements, and no one calls someone secretive for not narrating a private conversation with a parent. Yet when it comes to photos, faces, personal milestones, the same logic gets treated differently, as if not broadcasting them signals something is wrong. Empaths often catch this inconsistency faster than anyone else because they are paying closer attention to rules the rest of the world accepts without question. And once you catch the inconsistency, you cannot pretend it makes sense anymore. So when an empath quietly closes a door, most people leave wide open, understand what is happening. It is not avoidance. It is not fear. It is the accumulated wisdom of someone who has learned, often the hard way, that not everything valuable needs to be witnessed to be real. Some things only deepen because they were never diluted by an audience in the first place. There is a question worth asking that almost no one stops to ask anymore. When did living a moment stop being enough? And when did that moment need to be captured, framed, and shown to strangers before it could count as real? Somewhere along the way, documentation quietly replaced participation. People stopped asking, "How do I want to feel this?" and started asking, "How do I want this to look?" And once that shift happens, something subtle but important gets lost. The difference between experiencing your life and managing the perception of it. Empaths tend to notice this shift faster than most people because they are unusually attuned to the moment presence turns into performance. Watch closely and you can feel it happen in real time. Someone is having dinner with people they love and mid-laugh, a phone appears. The moment does not stop, but something inside it splits. Part of the person stays at the table. Part of the person steps outside the table to think about angles, lighting, captions, timing. That split, however small, changes the texture of the experience. And empaths who are already sensitive to subtle shifts in emotional energy often feel that fracture before they can name it. Contrast the two ways of existing inside a moment. Performance asks, how will this look to someone else? Presence asks, how does this actually feel to me? Those two questions sound similar, but they produce completely different lives. A life built around performance is constantly borrowing its meaning from an audience. A life built around presence generates its own meaning privately, immediately, without needing permission from anyone watching. Empaths who resist constant documentation are rarely doing it to seem mysterious or superior. They are doing it because they have felt the difference between these two ways of living, and they have chosen the one that does not require an audience to feel complete. Here is where the story deepens, because there is a strange irony hiding inside modern life. People post more than ever, yet somehow feel more disconnected than ever. They document more experiences, yet remember fewer of them clearly. The moments become content before they become memory, filtered through the question of how it will be perceived rather than how it was actually lived. Empaths often sense this irony instinctively. They notice that the friend narrating every detail of a trip in real time somehow seems less present on that trip than the friend who says almost nothing about it until weeks later when it comes up naturally in conversation. Remembered vividly because it was never divided between living it and announcing it. This is not a rejection of technology or connection. It is a resistance to a very specific trading presence for approval. And once you see that trade clearly, it becomes hard to unsee. Every time a private moment gets converted into public content, something is exchanged: attention, energy, a piece of the moment's original intimacy. All of it gets spent in the transaction. Sometimes that trade is worth making. But empaths, more than most people, understand that it is not automatically worth making every single time, for every single moment, regardless of what is lost in the exchange. Consider the sunset that gets photographed instead of watched. The photo can be beautiful, but somewhere between raising the phone and finding the right angle, the sky stopped being experienced and started being captured. The eyes moved from the horizon to the screen. The breath that would have deepened while simply watching got interrupted by the small mechanics of composing a shot. None of this makes photography wrong. It simply illustrates something important, that documentation and immersion pull attention in two different directions, and a person can only fully inhabit one of them at a time. Empaths often choose immersion, not because they dislike memory or sharing, but because they have learned that unmediated experience carries a depth that curated experience rarely matches. There is a particular kind of joy that only exists in a moment nobody else witnesses: a private laugh, an unrecorded walk, a quiet realization that belongs entirely to the person having it. That kind of joy cannot be captured because capturing it changes its nature. The moment it becomes something to show, it stops being something to simply feel. This is where self-objectification quietly enters the conversation, though few people call it by that name. Every time a person filters their own experience through the question of how it will be seen, they are treating themselves partly as an object to be evaluated, rather than a person simply living. Empaths tend to resist this instinctively, sometimes without being able to explain exactly why it feels wrong. They sense the subtle discomfort of turning identity into something arranged for approval, personhood into something closer to a brand. And many quietly choose not to participate in that exchange, not out of judgment toward those who do, but because they want to remain fully human inside their own experience, rather than half performer, half participant. And this reveals something important about what it actually means to live fully. A fulfilled life does not require witnesses. A meaningful moment does not need an audience to validate that it happened. The deepest experiences are often the ones nobody else ever sees, because they were never divided between being lived and being displayed. Empaths who choose presence over performance are not opting out of life. They are opting into a version of it that stays undiluted, unfiltered, and entirely their own. And maybe that is the quiet trade worth naming out loud. Every unposted moment is not a moment lost. It is a moment kept whole, untouched by comparison, untouched by an audience's approval or indifference, belonging fully to the person who lived it. That kind of ownership is rare in a world constantly asking to be shown everything. And once you understand that, the empath's silence starts to look less like distance and more like devotion to the moment itself, exactly as it was before anyone else was ever invited to weigh in. There is a particular kind of empath almost no one talks about, the one who used to be open, not guarded, not private, not selective, open. The kind of person who shared freely, trusted quickly, explained themselves patiently, believed the best about people until proven otherwise. Then something happened, not a single event necessarily, but a slow accumulation of moments where that openness got mishandled. A confidence repeated somewhere it should not have gone, a vulnerable photo screenshotted and mocked, a sincere explanation twisted into evidence against them. And somewhere in that accumulation, a quiet decision formed, one that never got announced out loud. Enough. Not anger, just enough. This is the part of the story most people miss entirely, because they only see the after. They see someone quieter than they used to be, someone who stopped posting, stopped explaining, stopped making themselves so easy to read, and they assume damage. They assume the light dimmed. But often the opposite happened. The person did not become smaller. They became precise. They learned, through experience rather than theory, that not everyone who gains access to your inner world has earned the right to keep it. Contrast this with the story culture prefers to tell. Culture loves the version where staying open no matter what proves strength, where forgiveness means unlimited access, where a truly secure person supposedly welcomes everyone in without hesitation. It is a beautiful story. It is also quite often a dangerous one, because unlimited openness does not protect love. It invites exploitation. Endless availability does not deepen connection. It depletes the person offering it. And empaths, who often gave more than anyone realized for longer than anyone noticed, are frequently the ones who learn this lesson the hard way, at real personal cost. So when maturity finally arrives, it rarely looks like becoming cold. It looks like becoming intentional. The empath stops over explaining themselves to people who were never actually trying to understand. They stop offering emotional transparency to people who only wanted material to use later. They stop treating every request for access as a request that deserves to be granted. And yes, sometimes that shows up as simply not posting anymore, not because the world became scarier, but because a specific kind of exposure stopped feeling worth its price. Here's the reframe worth sitting with until it settles. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is often self-respect taking shape on the inside. The two can look nearly identical to someone watching from a distance, but they come from entirely different places. Withdrawal comes from fear of the world. Self-respect comes from finally understanding your own value well enough to stop handing it to people who never deserved it. One shrinks a life, the other protects one. This is where the story reaches its center, because underneath every choice to stay private, to stay present instead of performing, to stop feeding a system built on approval, there is a single question quietly being answered. What deserves access to me? Not who is asking loudest, not who expects it, not who feels entitled to it because everyone else seems to get it. What actually deserves it? That question, once an empath starts asking it honestly, changes the entire shape of their life, because it moves the center of gravity from other people's expectations back to their own discernment. And once that shift happens, something remarkable follows. The empath becomes harder to manipulate, because manipulation depends on a hunger for approval that no longer exists to exploit. They become harder to drain because their energy is no longer available on demand to anyone who asks. And they become harder to define from the outside because they are no longer performing a version of themselves for an audience to interpret. They have simply returned to belonging to themselves. This is not a small thing. In a culture built almost entirely around visibility, around proving, around constant self-display disguised as authenticity, choosing quiet ownership over public performance is one of the most radical decisions a person can make. It will be misunderstood because most people have been trained to read silence as absence and privacy as secrecy. But neither of those readings is accurate here. The empath who does not post their photos is not hiding from life. They are finally living it without translation, without performance, without asking a comment section to confirm what they already know to be true. So the next time you notice someone who seems to be living fully without documenting any of it, resist the urge to assume something is missing. Consider the opposite possibility. Consider that they may have simply stopped confusing visibility with worth, attention with love, and exposure with connection. Consider that their silence is not empty. It is full of moments that belonged only to them, full of a peace that never needed an audience to be real. And consider that maybe in a world constantly asking to be shown everything, the most powerful thing left is the ability to keep something for yourself, undiluted, unwitnessed, and entirely your own. That is not distance, that is depth. And depth, unlike visibility, was never meant to be measured by how many people were watching. Maybe that is the quiet lesson worth carrying long after this ends. Not every life needs to be announced to matter. Not every moment needs a witness to be real. And not every empath who stays quiet is hiding. Some of them have simply found something better than being seen. They have found the peace of finally being known by themselves first, and that has always been enough.